My Stormcast army is almost finished, and the last thing to do is the army's general, and I had this idea to put him on an epic base to make him stand out from the rest of the army on the battlefield. But before I get to the base, the first thing I got to do is get the base coats down. I want to get the Gryphstalker colours on first, so I start with 2 thin layers of Corvus Black. When I painted the Lord Vigilant's Gryphcraw, I based it on the colour of my dog Coco, so now it's Banjo's turn to be the inspiration. For the skin, I decided to have a pale colour with Rackart flesh as the base. 2 thin layers on the legs, the belly and the tail, and with the black feathers it almost gives him an eerie look to him, and it sets the tone nicely. I move on to the Lord himself, and of course this general has to be kitted out in gold. More specific, 2 layers of Liberator gold. I also use it on the parts of the shield, the Gryph's chest plate, his helmet and the axe. This guy is going to be looking good. For the other metal parts, I went to a lead belcher, and that's what's going to be used on the chainmail parts, his collar, the axe, the Gryph's armour and a few smaller parts spread across. For his cape and robes, I used Caldor Sky, but I made sure not to paint the inside of the cloak this time. A few models earlier, I was wanting the inside to be white, but I ended up painting the whole thing blue, but not this time. The cloak's inside will be white this time. I had sprayed the model with Rapebone before I started, so that's the white sorted. There are a couple of parchment parts on both sides of the model, so I whipped out some Rapebone and painted them with 2 thin layers. The last base coat down was the leather parts, which I'm going with a different colour this time, because I wanted to add a little bit more colour, so I went with corn red for the leather base coats. While the base coats are drying, I'm going to make a start on the base, and the idea I had was to have the Lord overlooking on a cliff. So I stuck a couple of styrofoam blocks together and I marked out the shape that I wanted it to be. When I was happy with the shape, I noticed that there was going to be a lot of blank space in front of it, so I thought it would be a perfect sewer entrance of some sort. First I thought of making a circular one with metal bars, but I couldn't help feel that it was a bit too modern, so I went with a medieval style drainage system. After I cut out the shape, I then took some toothpicks and used them as metal bars and stuck them in, and the base is really starting to take shape now. I set aside the base for now because I wanted to make a start on the shading, so I picked up some Stormvermin fur and I started to dry brush it on the Gryph's body. This is going to help the feathers pop a bit more when I add some diluted Nuln Oil over the black feathers. His legs and tail were next, but I only wanted to shade the bottom half of the legs with Seraphim Sepia. Hopefully this will have a clean to dirty look on him that make his feet appear more weathered looking. For the Lord himself, I started with the blue and silver first, because both of them were going to be shaded with Nuln Oil. The silver parts were pretty much straightforward, but for the blue cape, it's very easy to let the shade pool up in it, so I make sure to give it a good spread and keeping an eye on the recesses. Onto the gold then, and I wanted to keep it somewhat shiny, so I used a slightly diluted Reichland flesh shade just to darken it down a little bit. For ages I've just been using Retributor armour for gold, but after switching to a lighter Liberator gold and the Reichland flesh shade going over it, I'm really starting to love this combination. The last 2 shades were then done with Skeleton Horde on the parchment parts, and I wasn't sure what to put over the red, so I played it safe by just going with Agrax Earthshade. While the shades were drying, I switched back over to the base to give it a stone, rough ground look, and so I took out my pot of Astronite Granite, scooped it out and started spreading it all over while making sure I got all the foam covered. This stuff is great for stuff like this and for making really simple bases. The only downside is this stuff can take a while to dry unless you have a hairdryer handy, which I obviously haven't used one in years. We're at the final hurdle now for the painting, but unfortunately highlighting can be a tricky hurdle to get over, but I'm going to make it as simple as I can. We started off with the black on the Gryph, and I went back to Stormvermin fur, but this time just to highlight along the very edges of the feathers and some of the higher raised parts on the skin. For his legs, I went to a Karak stone, and this isn't a paint that I use that often, but it's just slightly lighter than Rackard flesh. I use it on the edges of the feet and along the bottom of the leg. The gold and silver then is carefully highlighted with Stormcast silver. His leg and the parts on the griff are easy to get to, but some of the parts are a little trickier, so taking your time when doing this is essential. The blue parts are then highlighted with Calgar blue, and I love this part because capes can be a big area of a model, and just by adding a simple edge highlight it really makes it pop out more. Next then is the parchment, and I went to a pallid witch flesh, but looking back at it now, I think it was a little bit too bright. Maybe I should have gone back to the base colour of rape bone, but it's still looking good. The final part for now was the leather, and I'm really liking this dark red leather colour, so I used Wazdaka red to highlight along the edges. Back to the base now, and with the Astronite granite finally dry, I wanted to add a bit more texture with a Grelin earth, and I love this stuff. The more of it you blob on, the more of a cracked earth effect you will get. I put it on parts of the cliff instead of putting it all over to try and give it somewhat of a natural look. When it was dry, I used Mechanica Standard Grey for the base coat, and then for a dirtier look, I used Agrax Earthshade instead of Nuln Oil, and I used it all over. The final paint then was a dry brush all over of Dawnstone. This is going to make these rocky details really stick out. One final detail I wanted to add on the cliffs was some ivy foliage, because I've had this army painter poison ivy for years, and I mean years, and I never really used it, so I think it's a perfect time to try it out. I carefully stick it on with some super glue across a few spots, and I think it's starting to look good. There were two parts that I had left until now, and the first was his head, and not having a good record with pale flesh tones, I wasn't messing around too much here. I based the head with pallid witch flesh and then used Gulliman flesh to finish it off. The final part of the Lord Vigilant was his flaming axe. I started off with a base coat of Templeguard blue. When dry, I made a shade mix of 70% Lemon Medium and 30% Thousand Suns Blue. The final highlight then was a dry brush of Templeguard blue with a small bit of white scar added in. I've done this colour scheme on the armory before, mostly on swords, but it's much simpler this time because it's not on a flat surface. I added some Astronite granite onto the base, and then I glued some sand on for more texture. And I knew I had to have some water flowing out, so I painted the base with white scar, because the AK water gel that I put on after usually turns a very dark blue, so maybe the white undercoat might brighten it up a bit, but I'm not getting my hopes up. Unfortunately it didn't really do anything, so I was going to have to brighten it up another way. I started off with Lothern blue, and I painted along the water's raised parts to give it a look of flowing water. When dry, I then go over the lines again, but thinner this time, with some white scar added into the Lothern blue. To brighten up the rest of the water, I used the Thousand Suns blue on the deeper parts, being careful not to get any on the brighter parts. I then switched to AK water foam, and it's really easy to overdo it with this stuff, so I just sponged it on along the sides and onto the lower parts of the rocks. I then used a small brush just to shape the edges of the foam. I made a start on the ground part then with a brown base colour of Gortor Brown, a shade of Gore Gruntifer, and then a final dry brush of Gortor Brown to brighten it back up. This guy took me way longer than I had planned for, but as a centrepiece for my Stormcast Skaventide army, I think it was worth it. The river water was a real challenge and there was a lot of back and forth with it, but I think I just about pulled it off. I'm really happy to have the whole Skaventide box finished now, which is a first for me, and I'm sure there will be more models added into both armies in the future. Well, that wraps up the Skaventide box, a great kit that kept me busy for a while. But if you guys like these videos, make sure to let me know in the comment section below, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and thanks for watching.